I always liked living alone. I don't live alone anymore, mind you. I have a family. As much as I enjoyed living by myself, and I do miss it, the scariest experience I've ever had in my life occurred when I rented a house all to my lonesome. The night that this took place, I had gotten home from work rather late. I only worked until 6 p.m., but the snow had begun to fall pretty steadily in the hours before my shift was over. By the time I was finally ready to go home, the ground was completely covered in at least a foot of snow, and the snow was still falling pretty heavily. It was difficult to see more than a couple of feet in front of my car, so after I took the time to scrape all the snow off the top, I slowly crept my way home. It was nearly 10 p.m. by the time I got there. I was just pretty thankful I didn't have to work the next day. It's probably mildly important to understand the place where I lived. It was a subdivision, but a much older one. Years before, many of the houses had been torn down, so now there were only a few houses on my street, and there was only a single streetlight, maybe 30 feet down the road from my home. While I was driving, I saw someone out and walking on the street. He was standing right underneath the street lamp. I figured it was just one of my neighbors, so I passed him by and pulled over into my driveway and made myself comfortable. I went inside and took a quick and warm shower, got myself wrapped up in a warm blanket, and made myself a cup of tea. I went into my living room to watch a little bit of television and hopefully unwind. As I walked in, though, I happened to glance out the front window. I was a bit surprised to see the shape of that man still standing in the same exact spot under the street lamp. The snow was falling really hard. Because of this, I couldn't make out a single thing about the guy other than the vague shape of his body. I tried not too much to think about it. Must be someone who was waiting for a ride or something. I sat down and turned my television on. I had my cup of tea in my hand. It took me a good half hour before I was done with it. Deciding I wanted another one, I got up when I suddenly remembered that man who had been standing under the street lamp. Curiosity got the better of me, and I happened to glance out of the window. He was still there, still standing in the exact same spot. I was beginning to get rather nervous. I walked over to my door and double-checked to make sure it was locked. I couldn't tell if the person was watching me or what they were doing. I went back into the kitchen and made myself another cup of tea. When I came back, I once again glanced out the window. This time, I was somewhat relieved to see the man now appeared to be gone. I felt like I could finally relax again. I'm not sure how long I sat in my chair watching television. All I do know is that I was indeed finally feeling completely relaxed. Although I'd gotten my mind off of thinking about the shape of that man, I found my mind suddenly brought back to it for some reason. I began to feel some sort of nagging suspicion. I couldn't quite understand why at first, until I barely noticed something in the corner of my eye. I glanced at that side window and felt an immediate shock run through my body. I saw a man standing silently outside my home, looking in at me through the window. He was just staring at me. I freaked out. It had been an hour since I'd seen him under the light, and it made me wonder if he'd been at that window, silently watching me the entire time. When he noticed that I'd seen him, he moved quickly and smashed the window in. I have to say, I'm pretty impressed with how I handled the situation. I jumped up involuntarily and sprinted to my bedroom. I grabbed my Louisville Slugger and came rushing back in to attack. The man was halfway in through the window, pulling himself in over the broken glass. Since he was vulnerable in that moment, I began to wail on him with the bat. The man grunted in pain a few times, and I smacked him over and over in the shoulder. This seemed to hurt him the most, and he fell back out the window. He stumbled to his feet and ran off into the night. I called the police right away, and they rushed out there immediately. They ended up grabbing the guy, which was a huge relief. What wasn't a relief was when they were investigating around my house. They found a meat cleaver laying in the snow just outside the window he had smashed in. Now this happened during my winter break at college. I won't mention my specific college, only that it was a rather large campus in a state that has some cold and snowy winters. The campus was always crawling with students at every time of day and even the night, but when winter came around, it became a complete ghost town. Now, I'm pretty sure there were still more people out there than I probably realized, but to me, it really seemed like it was completely empty. This winter, it was so cold that my dorm windows had frozen completely solid. I couldn't even see through them. It was snowing constantly as well. We had sub-zero temperatures and an ungodly wind chill every day. Still, I had my job delivering pizza. It was busy as hell delivering pizza on a college campus, and it certainly didn't get much easier in the winter either. In fact, in the winter, it was much easier to have the pizza delivery boy bring your pizza to you than to go to the store and buy any other food for yourself. The winter break was really the only, break that I ever got. On this snowy and freezing day, we were not very busy. I think it was around 7 p.m. when we got an order for a plain cheese pizza. It was an off-campus delivery. Also, they were paying in cash. I absolutely hated that. It was so much less stressful when customers just paid online with their credit card or whatever. It was a really hard drive as well, because even though the roads had been plowed, it was constantly snowing and freezing back over. A couple of times, my car even skidded and slid around on the road. I arrived to the house and pulled into the driveway. I preferred to park out on the street, but this person had an unnecessarily long driveway. I got out and even slipped and almost fell on the unsalted steps, but somehow I managed to get to the door. I rang the doorbell only to have no one answer. I rang it again, still no answer. I was beginning to think I'd been right all along, and this order was simply a prank. I always suspected that when people said they'd pay in cash when we arrived. Finally, just as I was about to leave though, isn't that always the way it works? Someone finally opened the door. It was the nastiest, smelliest man I'd ever encountered in my life. His face was covered in scabs and blood, and he was even picking at one of them. I really didn't even want to touch any of the money that he was going to give me. And the worst part was that he had a hunting knife strapped to his belt as well. Fortunately, it was still snapped into its sheath. But it seemed quite weird to be walking around your own house with a knife strapped to you. "Oh hey, sorry, I forgot my wallet," the man told me. "Come on in and I'll get it so I can pay you." I declined, telling the man I was fine. I'd rather just wait outside on the porch. "Aw, come on man, nonsense. It's freezing out there. Come on in, you can at least be warm while you're waiting. It might take me a while to find it." This was too bizarre. He wanted me to come inside, and he didn't seem to know where his wallet was. Plus, I couldn't stop thinking about that knife strapped to his belt. I was not going to go in. In fact, there was nothing more in life that I wanted than to just leave right now. I declined another time. The man stopped picking at his face and seemed quite annoyed. I couldn't imagine why though. He lowered his hand to the knife and undid the sheath. He then told me very sternly, "I insist you come in right now to warm up." Well, screw that. I'd seen way too many horror movies to do something that stupid. I told the man the pizza was on the house then, and I was just going to leave. I held it out to him, but he refused to take it. He rested his hand on the knife and began to look angry. Finally, I just had enough. I screamed out fine and dropped the pizza to the floor where I stood. His hand resting on the knife now gripped it firmly. He pulled it out of the sheath, but not all the way. Not wanting to turn my back on this man, I slowly walked backwards off the porch. I tried to continue to watch him, but stupidly I'd forgotten how slippery his steps were. I slipped on the ice and fell down onto my butt. I was still watching the guy, so as he continued to approach and stepped over the pizza and pulled his knife out fully, I had time to scramble to my feet, run to my car, and get in. The man stopped a few feet from my car as I slammed it into reverse and got the hell out of there. I watched the man as I backed out. He simply stood in his driveway, knife in hand, watching me as I left. You sure do meet some weird freaks when you deliver pizza. I don't necessarily know how scary this story is in and of itself, but it is really strange. It happened back in the mid-1990s. Although I'm from the Chicago area, for a period of about 9 months or so, I lived in Racine, Wisconsin. My parents lived in a town in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. I didn't have a car myself, so in order to visit my parents for the holiday, I had to take a bus from Racine to Kenosha, and then catch a metro train in Kenosha. There were only about 4 trains leaving each day, and the bus that dropped me off arrived about 4 hours before my train left. The reason I'm telling you all of this is so you understand the exact situation I was in. I was going to go visit my parents for Christmas, so a few days beforehand, I caught the bus. When I arrived in Kenosha, I had 4 hours to spare. The area of the train station didn't really have that much to do, so I had to find a way to occupy myself for 4 hours. It was very, very cold, and it had been snowing ever since before I got on the bus. The train station itself was a simple platform. There was no building to stay inside and no way to get warm either. I didn't have much money on me, but I had at least enough to go eat at a Wendy's or something. Unfortunately, I could not hang out in there too long after I'd eaten, so I decided the best thing to do was burn up some time and walk around, maybe browse in some stores for a few moments whenever I needed to warm up. This plan was working pretty well so far. Whenever my eyes started stinging from the cold or I was too sick of trudging through the piles of snow, I would duck into one of the stores. There weren't very many, as I had mentioned, and most of them were thrift shops or antique stores. At one point, the snow was falling so hard I could barely see, and the wind was making it slap against my face so hard it hurt, so I quickly ducked into the first building I came to. Immediately, I felt like I'd entered the Twilight Zone or something. Inside, instead of a store like I'd expected, it was this huge warehouse. There were sheets hung up all over the place that seemed to act like walls. They'd actually even made rooms out of the hanging bed sheets. And in those bed sheet rooms were tables that seemed to be set up selling things. There were tons of weird things being sold by shady-looking people. I thought that I should immediately leave this place, but I remembered just how cold it was outside. I figured I had to waste a little bit of time first, so I walked through some of these bedsheet rooms. It took me quite a while, but past these rooms on the other end was this wide open space with a bar and some tables. It was even weirder than the Cantina bar from Star Wars. There were about 30 people sitting around. I know this is gonna sound insensitive, but it looked like a retired freak show act or something. The bartender was this huge guy covered in boils. There was a man sitting at the bar that looked around 7 foot 6 inches tall, with braces all over his body. I kid you not, there was also at least 10 people with prosthetic limbs sat at the tables, and these were old prosthetics as well, people with hooks for hands and that sort of thing. An eerie tune was playing on this old jukebox too. I began to actually feel a bit overwhelmed at all this scenery. I wasn't scared per se and really had no reason to be, but it was extremely weird. The only way I can think to describe it is I was surprised with how strange it was. It was almost overwhelming my senses. I decided I had to get out of there, so I tried to find my way back out through all the bed sheets. It was such a maze though that I'd actually gotten lost. I kept going through rooms only to find places I'd never seen on my way in. I tried not to pay too much attention to the people or the strange things they were selling, but several people looked at me and seemed to be getting very annoyed. I began to get even more worried when I couldn't seem to find my way out. My mind was completely overwhelmed. I began to wonder if I really had stepped into the Twilight Zone or something. My body began to tingle, and I felt dizzy as well. If I'd been familiar with panic attacks back then, I would have realized I was having one. Then the worst thing happened. I stumbled into a room I hadn't seen before. There was a small, naked man sitting in the center, and the floor was covered in blood. He was using a knife to viciously cut himself. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't look away. The man slowly turned up and looked at me. He angrily jumped to his feet, brandishing his bloody knife. I lost it. I turned the other way and just ran. I needed to get the hell out of that place. I got all sorts of dirty looks, and people began to chase me, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. I did finally, and I can't tell you how relieved I was when I left. I ran, and I didn't stop until I was back to the Wendy's I mentioned earlier. I didn't have much more money, but I figured I could buy a drink every half hour in order to be warm and in that safe place. I'm sorry if that story isn't traditionally scary. It was pretty scary to me, though. Most people I tell it to just find it to be odd. I'm also sure some people don't believe me, but I never dared to go back and find the place again. Although I know the Twilight Zone doesn't really exist, I thought I really had found it that day. Remember the early days of the web? AOL software upgrades arrived in the mail on a CD-ROM. Family members shouted across the house at one another if an incoming call on the landline interrupted the painstaking 10 minutes it took to get from the America Online sign-in screen to hearing "You've Got Mail" reverberate throughout the room. Recipients of those multicolored chain emails, a serial killer camping out in a young girl's shower and killing her guard dog, truly pondered the threat against their luck for the next 7 years if they didn't abide by the message's command to forward it to at least 7 friends. Better not risk it, we told ourselves, as we quickly typed out 7 email addresses in the recipient field. Finding everything there was to know about a person online, something anyone can do today with a few keystrokes and a credit card, was a lot harder to do back then. But not for Corey. I was 15 years old. At the time, ambiguous and exotic usernames like Pina Colada 33 or Brunette Baby 87 were all the rage. Naive as we early screen name pioneers were, this anonymity was pretty smart. Social media was in its infancy. Zanga was the go-to haven for teens and tweens to vent their angst, while informing the world that we're currently listening to screaming infidelities by Dashboard Confessional. Everyone was friends with Tom on MySpace. AIM didn't exist yet, but if you had an AOL account like I did, you were set up with all you needed to discover this new hyper-connected, free-for-all world of the early 2000s World Wide Web. Your own email inbox, a new page to create a personal profile, access to chat rooms on just about any topic or hobby you could possibly imagine. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. One afternoon, I jumped into one of these random chat rooms. Age, sex, location? 16, female, Boston. I watched the usual exchange between 2 total strangers scroll across my screen for several minutes, hoping to find my opportunity to chime in and introduce myself. Ultimately, I got bored and left the chat without typing a single word though. All of a sudden, I realized I'd gotten a notification. A message appeared on my screen. "Hey, you never said anything. Why not?" "Who's this?" I responded, confused by this username I didn't recognize. "My name's Corey. I'm 16, 8th grade in Lake Charles, Louisiana. What about you?" 16 and in 8th grade? Yikes. I couldn't imagine what the story was behind that. "So, you get held back once or twice, or what?" I teased. And so the conversation began. We struck up a brief online friendship that very same afternoon. He shared a photo of himself. Freckled face, brown hair, nothing I'd rate above a 5 on hot or not. Yet despite the friendliness, I refused to tell him where I was from or anything personal about me beyond my first name and my age. I knew very little about the dangers of the internet back then. I wasn't exactly dumb either. My username was just some random fruity drink and some random numbers. Safe enough, I figured. I did have one of those AOL user profiles. Its standard features included a profile picture and a questionnaire to fill out some fun facts about yourself. My photo was one of me with several friends, with no indication of which one could be me whatsoever. A few days later, Corey messaged me out of the blue. "You're beautiful, you know." Brunettes with green eyes, man. Despite my photo containing 4 people, he'd accurately identified me. "I'd love to see you in person sometime." I felt my skin prick. I politely told him something to the effect of that not being possible and quickly logged off. Friday the following week, I was sleeping over at my best friend's house. I was logged into my account in the background as we thirstily browsed cute guys on Hot or Not when I got a notification. "Who's messaging you?" my friend asked. I knew right away it was Corey. "Hey, found out some stuff about you. You live in Houston. Your parents are James and Sarah Miller, and you live at 1655 South Grand. You know that feeling when you're on a roller coaster during a sharp drop and your heart jumps into your throat? That was that moment." Fortunately, we managed to find the block user function quite easily that night. That was it. So long, creepy 16-year-old middle schooler with scarily good online sleuthing skills. Well, that didn't last long though. The next day, a screen name similar to Corey's messaged me out of nowhere. He had another account. I quickly blocked him. This happened many more times. Finally, I went dark altogether. Sure, I missed the thrill of seeing the yellow envelope appear in my virtual inbox, but this was better than being harassed by Corey. A few weeks later, I got home from school. My sister was a baby at the time, 14 years my junior, so she had a nanny who stayed with her during the day while my parents were at work. As I walked through the door of the kitchen, the nanny handed the phone to me. "It's for you," she said with a quizzical look on her face. "Who is it?" "I really don't know. Some boy with a twang in his voice or something. Sounds like he's from East Texas or Louisiana perhaps." I grabbed the phone. "Hello?" "Hey, pretty thing. It's Corey. So, my friends and I, we're into this show Jackass. We're thinking of making a trip over to Houston and doing some pranks around town next week. How hilarious would it be if we surprised you at your front door?" I choked out a nervous laugh. I mumbled an excuse about taking a quiz the next day and quickly hung up. For the next few weeks, I slept with a knife under my mattress. I was terrified I'd wake up to this stranger on the balcony outside my window. How did he even get my phone number? Just as soon as he'd invaded my security, though, he seemingly disappeared. No messages, no uninvited calls. The knife eventually went back to its respective kitchen drawer. 2 months passed without a single thing from Corey, and I finally felt safe. Until the phone rang the very first week of summer break. "Hi," the voice said curtly. "Who's this?" "It's me, Corey." Let me be clear. This voice was not the same voice I'd heard 2 months ago. That voice had been dripping in southern syrup. It was young and full of mischief. This new voice was different, cold, lacking any discernible accent, and immediately I could tell I was speaking to a grown man. "Sorry I haven't been able to talk to you lately. I feel terrible, but the police came to my house. They took my computers away from me. Can't say why, but don't worry, I'll come and find you soon." That was the last day I ever used my username. I deleted that account. I embarrassingly told my parents about my huge mistake, despite having shared nothing that could have easily revealed my personal identity. Even if I had, the threat back then was not the same as it is now. This was nearly 20 years ago. People didn't have the same online presence they do today. As a teenager with no social media, I was virtually a ghost. But somehow, this predator, who clearly had advanced knowledge of computers and the internet, singled me out and made it his mission to learn everything about me through whatever means possible. He was determined to get me. The only thing I'm grateful for was that even at 15, I knew better than to trust this freckle-faced kid from a random chat room completely. 2 decades later, I still wonder where Corey ended up. He never did come to find me, but hopefully he ended up behind bars.